Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a story today that has more twists and turns than, than a pretzel factory.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Haha, thanks.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about the recent release of American teacher Marc Fogel from Russian detention.
Right, and it's a story that really beat us scratching our heads because Fogel's release happened under the Trump administration.
Yeah, and that's interesting because we saw, a bunch of prisoner swaps under the Biden administration that didn't include him at all.
Exactly. So it makes you wonder about how these negotiations actually work behind the scenes,
Right,
right?
right. What were they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about some pretty high-profile releases, right? Like Brittney Griner, Evan Gershkovich.
Right.
So what was it about Fogel's case that was different?
That's what we're going to try to figure out today. And of course, there's the whole issue of the exchange,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
the details of which are still like totally secret.
Yeah, nobody's talking.
Yeah.
So what did the U.S. maybe give up to get Fogel back? Okay, so let's rewind a bit first. For those who might need a refresher, can you give us like a quick rundown on who Marc Fogel is and how he ended up in a Russian prison?
Okay, so Marc Fogel is an American school teacher from Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
And back in 2021, he was arrested in Russia
For what?
for carrying 17 grams of marijuana.
17 grams.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which he said was for medical reasons.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to treat chronic back pain.
Okay.
But that got him a 14-year prison sentence.
14 years.
14 years.
For 17 grams of marijuana? That's wild.
Yeah, and it's pretty crazy, right? Because here in the U.S., that would be like, maybe a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, maybe a fine at most.
Exactly. But you go to another country and boom, 14 years.
So it's a totally different ballgame when it comes to international law.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Different countries have different rules, different systems, and what might seem like a small thing here could be a huge deal somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a good reminder for anyone traveling abroad for sure. Do your research.
Definitely. And in Fogel's case, it gets even more complicated because the U.S. government actually designated him as wrongfully detained last year.
Right. What does that actually mean, wrongfully detained?
So basically, it means that the U.S. government believes that an American citizen is being held unjustly overseas.
So they're saying like, hey, this isn't right.
Exactly. And it's not just talk. When they use this designation, it bumps the case up to a higher level of, diplomatic urgency.
Okay, so they're not messing around.
No, they're not.
Ah.
And it often means that they'll start being more aggressive and trying to get that person released.
So it's not just quiet diplomacy behind the scenes anymore?
Nope. It often becomes a lot more public, too. They'll put pressure on the country that's holding the person.
Got it. So it's like they're shining a spotlight on the situation.
Exactly. And in Fogel's case, this wrongfully detained label definitely helped keep his story in the news and put pressure on Russia to do something.
And of course, we can't forget about Fogel's family during all of this.
Oh, yeah.
I remember seeing reports about how frustrated and disappointed they were when he was left out of those earlier prisoner swaps.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine?
It's heartbreaking.
Years of not knowing what's going to happen.
Right? And they were really vocal about it, too.
Oh, yeah. They kept fighting for him. And it makes sense, right? These aren't just political games. We're talking about real people's lives,
Yeah.
families' hopes, dreams, all put on hold.
Right.
It's a huge burden for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And speaking of action, we have to talk about Steve Witkoff, the guy who actually got Fogel released.
Right. He's not exactly a household name.
No, not really. But his role in this whole thing is super interesting.
So Witkoff, he's a former real estate executive,
Okay.
and he had served as President Trump's special envoy to the Middle East.
Okay.
So this wasn't like, your typical diplomats working through the usual channels.
Right.
Witkoff took a more personal, almost like secret approach.
It's like what they call back channel diplomacy. Yeah.
Exactly. We hear about it sometimes, but it's always super hush-hush.
Yeah, because it basically means working outside of the normal diplomatic protocols.
Right. Often relying on personal connections and informal channels.
So it's riskier.
It can be.
Yeah.
And less transparent, too.
But it can also be faster.
Sometimes, yeah, if you need to bypass a lot of red tape.
And in Fogel's case, it seems like it worked.
It did. Witkoff not only negotiated his release, he actually flew back to the U.S. with Fogel.
Wow. He personally escorted him.
He did.
That's some serious dedication.
It really is. He was really committed to getting Fogel home.
It's like something out of a movie.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And it shows you that sometimes these unconventional approaches can actually get things done.
Okay, so we've set the stage now. We know who Marc Fogel is, how he got arrested, and the unusual way he was released.
Right.
But there's still this big question mark hanging over everything.
The exchange.
Exactly. We know that something was given up to get Fogel back.
But what was it?
Nobody's saying.
Nope.
It's like we've got this puzzle box, and we can see the shape of the pieces, but there's this one crucial piece missing.
And one that would reveal the whole picture.
Exactly. It's driving us crazy.
I know, right? What do they trade for Fogel's freedom?
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, but also kind of scary, right? I mean, we're just left to guess about what might have been on the table.
Well, guessing can be helpful sometimes,
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there have been similar situations before.
Right.
So if we look at, past prisoner exchanges,
Right.
it might give us some clues about what happened here.
Okay, so what are some examples that might shed some light on this?
Well, one that jumps out right away is that 2010 spy swap, the illegals program. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah, vaguely. Remind me.
So the U.S. swapped 10 Russian sleeper agents. They had been living undercover in the U.S. for years.
Wow.
And in return, they got 4 people who had been convicted of spying for the West.
Oh, yeah. That was the case with Anna Chapman, right? It was a huge story at the time.
Yeah, actually, it was all over the news.
Okay, but how does that relate to Fogel's situation?
Well, it shows us that governments are willing to make some pretty big concessions to bring their people home.
Okay.
I mean, in the illegals program swap, you had people accused of really serious crimes, espionage, intelligence gathering.
Right.
So it shows you that the stakes can be really high in these kinds of negotiations.
So if we're thinking along those lines with Fogel's case,
Yeah.
could it mean that the U.S. maybe released a high-value Russian prisoner?
It's definitely possible. I mean, Russia's always been really interested in getting back people who are involved in like espionage, cybercrime, or arms dealing.
The people they consider really important assets.
Exactly. So yeah, a straight up prisoner swap is a real possibility.
Okay, but you were saying earlier that there are other things that can be done too, right? Like it doesn't always have to be a one-for-one swap.
Oh, absolutely. There are other things that could be in play. Like, for example, the U.S. might have offered some kind of sanctions relief.
Ooh, that would be a big deal, right? Especially with everything going on with Ukraine.
Huge.
Yeah.
And it would be super controversial.
Yeah, so what would that look like exactly?
Well, it could mean easing up on some of the restrictions on certain Russian businesses or people,
Okay.
like maybe letting them access frozen assets or, resuming trade in certain areas. Basically giving Russia a bit of a break economically in exchange for letting Fogel go.
Right. And that would ruffle some feathers, for sure.
Oh, yeah. A lot of
Dang.
people would be upset, especially in Europe.
Because it would be seen as the U.S. going soft on Russia.
Exactly.
So it's a risky move.
It is a big risk, but it could be seen as a way to, be practical.
Like a way to get an American citizen back.
Right. But it could also be seen as a sign of weakness.
And that could make Russia even bolder.
It's a tough call with big implications.
Okay, so we've got those two main possibilities then. Prisoner swap or sanctions relief. But is there anything else we should be considering? Could the exchange be something totally different?
There's always that chance, right? I mean,
Mm.
diplomacy is tricky. It's like a chess game, people say. You make your moves strategically, but it's not always clear what the end goal is.
Right.
So maybe the U.S. offered something less concrete, like a promise of diplomatic support on a certain issue,
Okay.
or an intelligence sharing agreement,
Mm.
or even just, a commitment to tone down the rhetoric in certain areas.
Wow. So many possibilities. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion only to find more layers.
Exactly. And until we know what the exchange actually was,
We're just stuck guessing.
right, and thinking about what all the different possibilities could mean.
So what does all of this mean for the future of U.S.-Russia relations? I mean, are things thawing out a little, or are we still in the deep freeze?
Fogel's release could be a good sign, right?
Like a glimmer of hope.
Yeah. It could mean that both sides are still willing to talk to each other and find some common ground, even with all the tension.
But it could also just be a one-time thing.
True.
Like their interests just happen to align for a moment, but it doesn't mean anything's really changed.
It's too early to say for sure. We'll have to see what happens next. What choices they make in the coming days and weeks will be really important.
Because it'll tell us if this was just a fluke or the start of something bigger.
Exactly.
It's like we're at a fork in the road, and the path we choose now will have, big consequences. Not just for the U.S. and Russia, but for everyone.
I agree. The whole world's watching to see how this plays out.
Right, because what happens between these two countries affects everyone.
Absolutely. It has implications for global security, international norms, you name it.
And it affects real people's lives, too.
That's important to remember.
Yeah. So amidst all the politics and
We
strategy.
can't forget about the human side of things.
Right. Marc Fogel is back home with his family now, and that's something to celebrate.
Definitely.
But his case also makes you think about some tough questions, right?
Like what?
Like, what does freedom really cost?
Hmm.
And what are the moral dilemmas we face in a world where diplomacy is often so secretive?
Those are important questions to think about.
Yeah. Okay, so as we head into the last part of our deep dive,
Okay.
let's shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture.
Sounds good.
What can we learn from Marc Fogel's experience? And what does it tell us about the relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
And how do we navigate a world that seems to be getting more and more uncertain and chaotic?
Exactly. Lots to unpack.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about the specifics of Marc Fogel's case, but I'm curious, what are the bigger takeaways here? Like, what can we all learn from this?
Well, I think Fogel's case really shows us how vulnerable Americans can be when they're traveling abroad.
Especially in countries where, things aren't exactly peachy keen between us and them.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even small things can have huge consequences depending on where you are.
Like his 14-year sentence for a little bit of marijuana? I mean, come on.
Right. It's a stark difference from how things would be handled here in the U.S. It really highlights how important it is to understand the laws and customs of any country you visit.
For sure. Do your research, people.
Absolutely. And Fogel's case also brings up some interesting questions about how diplomacy works these days. Like Steve Witkoff's back-channel negotiations were successful.
Right, he was working outside the usual channels.
Exactly. So it makes you wonder, could this become more common in the future?
Like, could we see more of this informal diplomacy happening behind the scenes?
It's possible. But then it also raises questions about transparency and accountability, right? If deals are being made in secret, how can we be sure they're being done ethically?
Good point. And then there's the whole ethical dilemma of prisoner exchanges in general. I mean, trading one person's freedom for another always feels morally complicated.
It is, especially when the crimes involved are so different.
Yeah.
It forces us to think about some tough questions.
Yeah, like are all lives valued equally?
Yeah.
And how do we balance individual freedom against national interests? It's a sticky situation for sure.
It is. And of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine.
Right, which has just made everything between the U.S. and Russia even more tense.
Absolutely. It's made cooperation on things like prisoner exchanges so much harder.
Because every action is viewed through the lens of this bigger conflict.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for things to improve between the U.S. and Russia?
It's tough to say. Vogel's release could be a good sign.
Yeah.
Maybe it shows that there's still a chance for communication and cooperation.
Like a little crack in the ice.
Maybe. But it could also just be a one-time thing. A moment of pragmatism in an otherwise very adversarial relationship.
So it's a wait-and-see situation.
I think so. We'll have to see what happens next and what kind of choices both countries make.
Because those choices will have a ripple effect on the whole world.
Absolutely. Everyone's watching to see how this plays out.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I'd say the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged. These aren't just abstract political issues. They affect real people's lives.
Like Marc Fogel.
Right. And so many others. So we need to be informed citizens and advocate for a world where diplomacy and human rights are top priorities.
Well said. And while we're happy for Marc Fogel and his family, let's not forget about the other Americans who are still being held unjustly around the world.
Their stories are important too.
We need to keep fighting for their safe return. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, keep asking questions and keep pushing for a better world.
That's what it's all about. Till next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.